I'm Nicole, 24 years old, and 6 months ago my parents told me there wouldn't be enough space for me at our annual family retreat to the lake house, the same retreat I'd been attending since I was 5 years old. What they didn't mention was that they'd invited my cousin's new girlfriend and her 2 kids instead, people who'd been in the family for exactly 3 months. So I did something that completely changed the power dynamic in our family forever. I bought the lake house they'd been renting for 20 years, and when they showed up for their family retreat, they found me sitting on the deck with an eviction notice and the biggest smile of my life. Before we dive into this absolutely insane story of family priorities gone wrong, I need to know what you think happened next. Did my family apologize and beg to stay? Did they try to fight me legally? Drop your predictions in the comments below and smash that like button because this revenge story shows exactly what happens when parents choose favorites over their own children. Subscribe because the way this all unfolded is pure karma, and you're going to want to see every single detail of how this played out. The annual Thompson family retreat to Lake Serenity had been the cornerstone of our family traditions for as long as I could remember. Every summer, for 2 weeks in July, our extended family would gather at the beautiful lakefront house that my parents rented from the Hendersons, an elderly couple who had owned the property for decades and had become like honorary grandparents to all of us kids. The lake house was everything you'd imagine from a perfect family vacation spot, a sprawling log cabin with 6 bedrooms, a wraparound porch overlooking the crystal-clear water, a private dock where we'd spend hours fishing and swimming, and enough space for the chaos and joy that came with gathering 3 generations of Thompsons under one roof. For 20 years, the routine had been exactly the same. Mom and Dad would book the house for the first 2 weeks of July, sending the deposit in January and the full payment by March. Extended family members would coordinate their vacation schedules around these dates, and everyone would contribute to groceries, activities, and shared expenses. It was our family's most important tradition, the event that kept our scattered relatives connected and created the memories that defined our sense of belonging to something larger than ourselves. I had grown up thinking of those 2 weeks as the best part of every year. As a child, I'd count down the days until we could pack up our cars and make the 3-hour drive to the lake. I'd learned to swim in that water, caught my first fish off that dock, had my first kiss during one of the beach bonfires when I was 16. The lake house represented everything good about being part of the Thompson family. My role in these gatherings had evolved over the years, but I had always been an integral part of the planning and execution. As a teenager, I'd been responsible for organizing activities for the younger cousins and helping with meal preparation. In college, I'd coordinated transportation arrangements and managed the group shopping lists. After graduation, when I started my career in event planning, I'd naturally taken over much of the logistics, creating schedules, booking local activities, and ensuring that everything ran smoothly for our increasingly large and complex family group. Last year's retreat had been particularly special because it marked 2 decades of continuous bookings at the same property. Mrs. Henderson had even joined us for dinner one evening, sharing stories about all the families who had stayed at her lake house over the years and commenting on how rare it was to see the same family return year after year with such obvious joy and appreciation for the tradition. "You Thompsons are special," she'd said, raising her glass of wine as we sat around the large dining table. "In 20 years, you've never missed a summer, never caused problems, never made me worry about my property. You treat this place like it's your own home, with respect and love. That's why I've never raised the rent on your parents, even though I could probably get twice as much from other renters." The comment about the rent was interesting because I'd never really thought about the financial aspects of our family tradition. I knew my parents paid for the house rental, but the specific amount had never been discussed openly. Mrs. Henderson's mention of keeping the rent low for us suggested that my parents were getting an exceptional deal that contributed to making these gatherings financially feasible for our large extended family. That evening, as we cleaned up after dinner and prepared for our traditional bonfire on the beach, I remember feeling overwhelmed with gratitude for the stability and continuity these retreats provided. In a world where families often grew apart due to distance, busy schedules, and changing priorities, we had managed to maintain a tradition that kept us connected across generations and geography. My cousin's children, the fourth generation of Thompsons to enjoy Lake Serenity, were building the same kinds of memories I had cherished as a child. They were learning family stories, developing relationships with relatives they saw only once a year, and absorbing the sense of belonging that came from being part of something bigger than their immediate families. The retreat served practical purposes too, functioning as an informal family reunion where important news was shared, relationships were maintained, and family decisions were made collectively. Engagements were announced during lake house dinners, business partnerships were discussed during early morning fishing trips, and family support networks were strengthened through the intimacy that came from spending concentrated time together in a relaxed setting. I had always assumed that my own children would someday participate in this tradition, that the lake house would be the setting where the fifth generation of Thompsons would learn to swim, catch fish, and understand what it meant to be part of our family's continuing story. But as I would discover during what I thought was routine planning for this year's retreat, my parents had developed very different ideas about who deserved to be included in our family's most important tradition, and their decisions would reveal priorities I had never suspected and favoritism that would change everything I thought I knew about my place in the Thompson family hierarchy. The first sign that something was different about this year's retreat came in February, when I reached out to Mom to start coordinating our usual planning process. For the past several years, I had taken the lead on organizing logistics, creating shared calendars, and managing the various details that made our large family gathering run smoothly. "Mom, I'm ready to start working on the lake house planning whenever you are," I said during one of our weekly phone calls. "Do you want me to reach out to everyone about dates and start putting together the activities list?" There was a pause that should have been my first warning that something was wrong. Mom had always been enthusiastic about retreat planning, treating it as one of her favorite annual projects. The hesitation in her response was uncharacteristic and immediately concerning. "Well, honey, this year might be a little different," she said carefully. "Your father and I are still working out some of the details, so maybe hold off on reaching out to everyone until we get things sorted." The vague response was unlike her usual direct, organized approach to family coordination. Mom was typically the kind of person who had plans locked in months in advance, who thrived on having every detail arranged and confirmed early. Her reluctance to begin planning in February for a July event was completely out of character. "Is everything okay with the Henderson rental?" I asked, trying to understand what could be causing the delay. "Are they not available for our usual dates, or is there some problem with the booking?" No, the dates are fine and the Hendersons are happy to have us back," she replied quickly. "It's just that we're reassessing some things about the group size and logistics this year." Reassessing group size was a phrase I'd never heard in connection with our family retreats. We'd always operated on the principle that family was family. If you were a Thompson or married to a Thompson, you were welcome at the lake house. The more people who could attend, the better the gathering was considered to be. Over the next few weeks, I noticed other unusual patterns in my parents' communication about the retreat. Phone calls that would normally include detailed discussions about food planning, activity coordination, and room assignments were instead filled with vague references to still working out the details and needing to finalize a few things. When I offered to help with specific tasks, creating the grocery shopping lists, researching local activity options, coordinating carpooling arrangements, I was told that they had everything under control and that I shouldn't worry about it this year. The dismissal of my help was particularly strange because my event planning expertise had been invaluable in previous years, and my parents had always appreciated my organizational skills and attention to detail. March came and went without any of the usual planning meetings or group communications about the retreat. By April, I was genuinely worried that there might be a serious problem, a financial issue, a health concern, or some kind of family conflict that was preventing the normal planning process from moving forward. "Mom, I'm getting concerned about the lake house situation," I said during a phone call in early April. "If there's some problem we need to solve, I'm happy to help. I could contribute more financially this year if money is tight, or help find alternative accommodations if there's an issue with the Henderson property." Her response revealed the first hint of what was actually happening, though I didn't fully understand the implications at the time. "Oh, sweetie, it's not about money or the property. It's just that we're trying to accommodate some new family circumstances this year, and we want to make sure everyone who really needs to be there has a place. The phrase "everyone who really needs to be there" was loaded with meaning I didn't yet grasp. In our family, everyone had always needed to be at the retreat. It was our most important tradition, the event that defined our family identity and maintained our connections across distance and time. What kind of new family circumstances? I asked, trying to understand what could be significant enough to disrupt 20 years of established tradition. Well, your cousin Jake is bringing Amanda and her kids this year, Mom explained, referring to Jake's girlfriend of about 3 months whom I'd met only once, briefly, at a family birthday party. Jake, my Uncle Paul's son, had a history of short-term relationships and had never brought anyone to family events before. The idea that he was now planning to bring a very new girlfriend and her children to our intimate family retreat was surprising, but not necessarily problematic. That's great that Jake's serious enough about someone to want her to meet the whole family, I said. Amanda seems really nice from what I remember. Are her kids close to the cousins' ages? Amanda has 2 boys, ages 8 and 10, Mom replied. And yes, we think they'll fit right in with the group. The conversation continued with discussions about logistics and room arrangements, but it wasn't until May that I began to understand the real implications of these new family circumstances and how they would affect my own place in the family gathering I had helped organize and cherish for my entire adult life. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday evening in mid-May, just 2 months before our traditional July retreat dates. I had been expecting to receive the usual group communication about final details, room assignments, and preparation responsibilities. Instead, I got a call from Mom that would fundamentally alter my understanding of my place in our family hierarchy. "Nicole, honey, I need to talk to you about the lake house situation," she began, her tone carrying the careful neutrality she used when she was about to deliver news she knew would be unwelcome. "Great, I've been waiting to get the details so I can start preparing," I replied, genuinely excited to finally begin the coordination process I'd been trying to initiate for months. "Well, that's what I need to discuss with you. This year is going to be a little different, and we've run into a space issue that we're going to need to work around." Space issue. In a 6-bedroom house that had comfortably accommodated our family for 20 years, including years when we'd had more people than we were planning to have this year. What kind of space issue? I asked, though I was already beginning to feel a sinking sensation that suggested this conversation was not going in the direction I had expected. With Amanda and her 2 boys joining us, we're at capacity for the house. Jake will be sharing a room with Amanda, and the boys will need their own space, so we're really stretched thin on bedroom arrangements. I started doing quick mental math. My parents took the master bedroom, my brother Mark and his wife took one of the other bedrooms, Jake and Amanda would take a 3rd bedroom, Amanda's boys would need a 4th bedroom, and that still left 2 bedrooms for other family members. Mom, that's only 4 bedrooms accounted for. The house has 6 bedrooms, plus the living room has that pull-out sofa that we've used before when we had overflow. I don't understand how we're at capacity. The pause that followed was long enough for me to realize that the mathematics of the space shortage was not the real issue here. Well, your Uncle Paul and Aunt Jennifer are coming, of course, and they'll need their own room. And your cousin Lisa is bringing her new baby, so she and Tom will need a room where they can have privacy with the little one. That was 6 bedrooms accounted for, which meant the house was indeed at capacity if everyone needed private rooms. But it still didn't explain why this was being presented to me as a problem rather than a simple logistical puzzle to solve. Okay, so where does that leave me? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. That's what I need to talk to you about, sweetheart. With the space constraints we're facing, and since you're single and flexible, we were hoping you might consider sitting this year out. Just this once, until we can figure out a better arrangement for next year. Sitting this year out. The family tradition I had attended for 19 consecutive years, that I had helped plan and coordinate, that represented my most cherished connection to our extended family, and I was being asked to sit out so that my cousin's girlfriend of 3 months and her children could attend instead. Mom, are you asking me not to come to the family retreat? "Oh, honey, it's not that we don't want you there. It's just a practical matter of space and logistics. We know you'll understand because you're so good at seeing the big picture and making sacrifices for the family." The irony of being excluded from the family gathering because of my reputation for making sacrifices for the family was not lost on me, though I was too shocked to fully process it in the moment. But Mom, Amanda, and her kids aren't even family yet. Jake has been dating her for 3 months. I've been coming to this retreat for my entire life. Nicole, that's not a very generous way to think about it. Amanda is important to Jake, and if this relationship is serious, then we want to welcome her and her children into our family traditions. That's what good families do. The lecture about what good families do, delivered to the family member who was being excluded to make room for virtual strangers, was breathtaking in its hypocrisy. What about what good families do for their own children? I asked, my voice beginning to shake with the emotions I was struggling to control. What about loyalty to the people who have been part of this tradition for decades? Sweetie, you're being dramatic. It's 1 year, and you're an adult who can certainly find other ways to spend your vacation time. This is an opportunity for Amanda's boys to experience what our family is all about, and that's more important than any individual person's preferences. More important than any individual person's preferences. My desire to attend the family retreat that had been the highlight of my year for 2 decades was being characterized as individual preference rather than legitimate family participation. The conversation continued for another painful 10 minutes, with Mom alternating between appeals to my understanding nature and subtle guilt trips about my resistance to the arrangement. But the core message was clear: I was not welcome at this year's family retreat because accommodating Jake's new girlfriend and her children was considered more important than including me. As I hung up the phone, I felt something crack inside me that had been holding my family relationships together for years. It wasn't just the exclusion itself, though that was devastating enough. It was the casual way it had been presented, the assumption that I would graciously accept being set aside for strangers, the complete lack of acknowledgement that this decision represented a fundamental betrayal of family loyalty and 20 years of shared tradition. But what hurt most was the realization that this exclusion revealed how my parents truly viewed my place in the family hierarchy. I wasn't a cherished daughter whose presence was essential to our family gatherings. I was a convenient family member who could be easily excluded when space was needed for people they considered more important. That night, as I lay in bed processing the conversation and its implications, I made a decision that would change not only this year's retreat but the entire future dynamic of our family relationships. If my parents wanted to treat our family traditions as flexible accommodations that could be adjusted based on their current priorities, I was going to show them exactly what that kind of flexibility looked like when the power dynamics were reversed. The anger I felt after my mother's phone call wasn't the explosive kind that burns hot and fades quickly. It was cold, calculated fury that sharpened my focus and drove me to take action in ways I'd never considered before. For the first time in my life, I was done being the accommodating family member who absorbed disappointment gracefully for the sake of family harmony. I spent the rest of that week researching everything I could about the Henderson property and the rental arrangement my parents had maintained for 20 years. What I discovered was both illuminating and infuriating in ways that added layers to my growing resentment about the retreat exclusion. Through public property records, I learned that the lake house was valued at approximately $850,000, a substantial but not unreachable amount for someone with my income and financial stability. More importantly, I discovered that Mrs. Henderson had been renting the property to my parents for only $2,800 per month for their 2-week stay, an exceptionally low rate that reflected her fondness for our family and her desire to keep the property occupied by people who cared for it properly. Comparable properties on Lake Serenity were renting for $4,000 to $6,000 per week during peak summer season, meaning my parents had been saving thousands of dollars each year due to Mrs. Henderson's generosity and loyalty to our family's long-term relationship with the property. But the most interesting discovery came when I found Mrs. Henderson's contact information and decided to call her directly. As a longtime family friend, she had always been warm and welcoming to me, and I felt comfortable reaching out to her about the situation. "Nicole, dear. How wonderful to hear from you, she said when I called, her voice carrying the same affection I remembered from our dinners together at the lake house. Are you calling about this summer's arrangements? I'm so looking forward to seeing everyone again. Actually, Mrs. Henderson, I was calling because I have some questions about the property. I know this might sound unusual, but would you ever consider selling the lake house? The question surprised her, and we spent the next hour in a conversation that would change everything about my family's annual tradition and my own relationship with the place that had defined so many of my happiest memories. Mrs. Henderson explained that she and her husband had been discussing the possibility of selling the property for the past year. They were both in their 80s now, and maintaining a vacation rental property was becoming increasingly difficult for them to manage. They had been reluctant to put it on the market because they loved the Thompson family and didn't want to disrupt our annual tradition, but they were beginning to feel that selling was the responsible decision for their own financial and physical well-being. We've been torn about it, she admitted. This property has given us so much joy over the years, and seeing families like yours enjoy it has been one of the greatest pleasures of our retirement. But we're not getting any younger, and our children think it's time for us to simplify our lives. I asked her about the potential selling price, and her answer was exactly what I had hoped to hear. Because of their age and their desire to see the property go to someone who would love and care for it the way our family had, they were willing to consider offers in the $750,000 range, well within the budget I could manage with my savings, my excellent credit, and my stable income from my event planning business. Mrs. Henderson, I said carefully, what if I told you I was interested in buying the property myself? I could guarantee that it would continue to be loved and maintained exactly the way you'd want, and I could provide references and financial documentation showing that I'm qualified to make the purchase. I need to pause here because what happened next is absolutely incredible, and you're probably starting to figure out where this is going. But trust me, the way this all played out was better than anything I could have planned. My parents thought they could just exclude me from our family tradition like I was some optional guest, but they had no idea that I was about to completely flip the script on them. Make sure you're subscribed because this next part is pure satisfaction, and you won't want to miss how their faces looked when they realized what I'd done. The conversation with Mrs. Henderson continued for another 30 minutes, during which we discussed the practicalities of a potential sale, the timeline that would work best for her and her husband, and the details of what the purchase would include. The property came fully furnished with all the furniture, appliances, and equipment that had made our family gatherings so comfortable and memorable. More importantly, Mrs. Henderson was genuinely excited about the possibility of selling to me specifically. She had watched me grow up during our annual visits, had seen how much I loved the property and how respectfully I treated it, and she felt confident that I would be an ideal owner who would preserve everything she and her husband had built there. Nicole, I can't think of anyone I'd rather see take over this property, she said warmly. You understand what makes this place special, and I know you'd take care of it the way it deserves to be taken care of. By the end of the call, we had agreed that I would submit a formal offer within the week, with a closing date that would give me ownership of the property by mid-June, perfect timing for the July retreat that my parents had excluded me from. The next step was arranging financing, which turned out to be surprisingly straightforward given my financial stability and the property's clear value. My mortgage broker was enthusiastic about the loan application, particularly when I explained that I had a background in event planning and intended to use the property for family gatherings and potentially small corporate retreats during non-family periods. Within 10 days, I had submitted my offer, had it accepted by the Hendersons, and was moving through the closing process with a speed and efficiency that reflected both my determination and the straightforward nature of the transaction. But the most satisfying part of the process was the plan I developed for revealing my ownership to my family. Rather than telling them about the purchase in advance, I decided to let them proceed with their retreat planning and show up at the property as scheduled, only to discover that their accommodating daughter whom they had excluded was now their landlord. I spent hours imagining the moment when my parents would pull into the driveway of the lake house, expecting to begin their family retreat with Amanda and her children, only to find me sitting on the porch with a glass of wine and the legal authority to determine who was welcome on the property and who wasn't. The irony was perfect. the family member they had excluded due to space constraints would now be the person who controlled all the space, and their 20-year tradition would now be entirely dependent on the goodwill of the daughter they had deemed expendable. The property closing took place on June 15, exactly 1 month before the scheduled family retreat. Sitting in the attorney's office, signing papers that made me the owner of the lake house that had been central to my family's identity for 2 decades, I felt a mixture of excitement, nervousness, and deep satisfaction that I had never experienced before. Mrs. Henderson attended the closing personally, bringing with her a thick folder of documentation about the property, maintenance records, local service provider information, operating instructions for all the appliances and systems, and even photo albums showing the various improvements and changes she and her husband had made over the years. "Nicole, dear, this property has been such a blessing in our lives," she said as we concluded the paperwork. "Knowing that it's going to someone who loves it as much as we do makes this transition so much easier. I have complete confidence that you'll take wonderful care of it." She also shared something that added another layer of irony to my family situation. Over the years, she had actually been hoping that someone from our family would eventually be interested in purchasing the property. She had assumed that if anyone made an offer, it would be my parents, given their obvious love for the house and their 2 decades of reliable tenancy. "I always thought your parents might want to buy this place eventually," she mentioned as we walked through the house one final time. "They seemed so attached to it, and they always talked about it like it was their own home. I'm surprised they never approached us about a purchase." The truth was that my parents probably couldn't have afforded to buy the property, even at the generous price the Hendersons had offered to me. Their financial situation, while comfortable, didn't include the kind of savings or credit profile that would have made a $750,000 purchase feasible, especially with their other obligations and expenses. But more importantly, it had never occurred to them that ownership might be desirable or necessary. They had been content with their discounted rental arrangement, never considering that circumstances might change or that their access to the property might someday be threatened. Now, ironically, the family member they had excluded from this year's retreat was the only person who had been motivated and able to secure permanent access to the property that defined our family traditions. After the closing, I spent the rest of June preparing for what I privately called the reveal. I arranged for professional cleaning services to ensure the house was in perfect condition, had the landscaping refreshed and the dock inspected and repaired, and made sure all the amenities were functioning properly. I also made some subtle improvements that reflected my new ownership status. I had a security system installed, upgraded the Wi-Fi network, and replaced some of the older furniture with pieces that were both more comfortable and more durable for large group gatherings. But the most important preparation was logistical and legal. I researched my rights and responsibilities as a property owner, consulted with an attorney about trespass and eviction procedures, and prepared documentation that would clearly establish my authority over who could and could not use the property. I also developed a detailed plan for how I wanted the confrontation with my family to unfold. Rather than ambushing them aggressively or creating unnecessary drama, I wanted to handle the situation with the same calm professionalism I brought to my event planning work. The goal was to make my point clearly and effectively while maintaining my dignity and avoiding the kind of family chaos that could overshadow the lesson I was trying to teach. During this preparation period, I continued to receive occasional updates from family members about retreat planning, though notably not from my parents directly. My brother Mark mentioned that they were finalizing arrangements and that everyone was looking forward to another great gathering. My cousin Lisa shared her excitement about bringing the new baby to his first lake house experience. None of them seemed to be aware that I had been excluded from this year's retreat, which suggested that my parents had either not told the extended family about their decision or had misrepresented the circumstances of my absence. This lack of transparency was typical of their conflict management style. They preferred to handle family problems privately rather than risk criticism or judgment from other family members. The week before the retreat, I drove up to the lake house to spend a few days getting settled and making final preparations. It felt surreal to walk through the familiar rooms and spaces as the owner rather than as a guest, to know that every piece of furniture, every view of the lake, every corner where family memories had been made was now mine to control and protect. I spent those days revisiting the places that had been most meaningful to me during our family gatherings: the dock where I'd learned to fish, the kitchen where I'd helped prepare countless family meals, the living room where we'd played board games during rainy afternoons, the deck where we'd gathered for evening conversations and sunset photography sessions. The house felt like home in a way it never had before, not just because of the memories it contained but because it now represented my own achievement and independence rather than my dependence on my parents' arrangements and decisions. On Friday evening, July 14th, I sat on the deck with a glass of wine and watched the sunset over Lake Serenity, knowing that tomorrow would bring the confrontation that would forever change our family dynamics. My parents, along with Jake, Amanda, her children, and the rest of our extended family, were planning to arrive mid-morning for what they thought would be their traditional 2-week retreat. Instead, they would discover that their accommodating daughter whom they had excluded had become their landlord, and that their access to the property and tradition they had taken for granted was now entirely dependent on someone whose feelings and preferences they had dismissed as unimportant. As I prepared for bed in the master bedroom that had always been my parents' domain, I felt a sense of anticipation and power that I had never experienced before. Tomorrow would be the day when 24 years of being the accommodating, flexible family member would end, and my parents would learn what it felt like to have their family traditions controlled by someone else's priorities and decisions. Saturday morning dawned clear and beautiful, the kind of perfect lake day that had made our family retreats so memorable over the years. I woke up early, made coffee in the kitchen that was now mine, and settled onto the deck to wait for my family's arrival. I had prepared a simple but effective setup: comfortable chairs arranged to face the driveway, a side table with legal documents and property ownership papers, and a cooler with drinks in case the conversation extended longer than anticipated. At exactly 10:30 a.m., I heard the sound of multiple cars coming up the gravel driveway. Through the trees, I could see the familiar convoy that marked the beginning of every family retreat: Dad's SUV leading the way, followed by Uncle Paul's pickup truck, Mark's minivan, and Jake's sedan with Amanda and her boys. The sounds of arrival were exactly as I remembered from childhood: car doors slamming, excited voices calling greetings to each other, the rustle of luggage and coolers being unloaded, children's laughter as they ran toward the lake. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness for the tradition that was about to be permanently altered by this confrontation. But then I remembered my mother's casual dismissal of my hurt feelings, her characterization of my exclusion as a practical matter of space, and my father's complete absence from the conversation about my participation in the family tradition I had helped maintain for years. I walked to the railing of the deck and called out in my most cheerful voice, "Good morning, everyone. Beautiful day for a lake house retreat, isn't it?" The response was immediate and telling. Several family members waved and called back greetings, clearly pleased to see me. But my parents exchanged confused glances, and I could see them having a hurried, whispered conversation near their vehicle. Mom recovered first, approaching the deck with the bright, false smile she used when she was trying to manage an uncomfortable situation. "Nicole, honey. What a surprise to see you here. Are you just stopping by to say hello before we get settled?" The assumption that I was merely visiting rather than residing at the property was exactly what I had expected, and it provided the perfect opening for my revelation. "Actually, Mom, I'm not just stopping by. I live here now. This is my house." The silence that followed was complete and profound. Even Amanda's boys, who had been running around exploring the property, seemed to sense that something significant was happening and stopped their playing to listen. Dad stepped forward, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the beginning of understanding. "What do you mean, your house?" "This is the Henderson rental property. We've had it reserved for this weekend for months." I pulled out the property deed and purchase documents, holding them up so everyone could see the official letterhead and legal formatting. "I bought the property from the Hendersons last month. This house now belongs to me, along with all the furnishings, the dock, and the entire waterfront lot." The Hendersons were ready to sell, and I was ready to buy. Uncle Paul, who had always been more direct than my parents, asked the obvious question, "Nicole, why didn't you tell us you were buying the lake house? This affects all of our family plans." His question provided the perfect opportunity to address the real issue underlying this confrontation. I didn't tell you because no one told me that I wasn't welcome at this year's family retreat. Apparently, there wasn't enough space for me because Jake's girlfriend and her children needed accommodating. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see several family members, particularly Uncle Paul and my brother Mark, looking at my parents with expressions of shock and disapproval. Mark was the first to respond. Wait, what? Mom, Dad, you told Nicole she couldn't come this year? Amanda, clearly uncomfortable with being at the center of a family conflict she didn't understand, stepped closer to Jake and whispered something in his ear. Her boys had moved to stand behind her, sensing the tension in the adult conversation. Mom attempted damage control, using her most reasonable tone. Now, everyone, let's not make this more dramatic than it needs to be. Nicole, sweetie, we explained that it was just a space issue this year, and we thought you'd understand. I interrupted her before she could finish rewriting the narrative. You explained that accommodating Jake's girlfriend of 3 months and her children was more important than including your daughter who has attended this retreat for 19 consecutive years. The specific details, 3 months of relationship, 19 years of my attendance, clearly landed with impact on the extended family members who were hearing this information for the first time. Jake looked mortified, apparently realizing that his invitation for Amanda and her children had come at the cost of excluding his cousin. Nicole, I had no idea. I never would have asked to bring Amanda if I'd known it meant you couldn't come. His genuine distress was touching, and it highlighted the fact that the decision to exclude me had been made by my parents without consultation or consideration of other family members' feelings about the arrangement. But Amanda surprised everyone by addressing the situation directly. This is really uncomfortable. Jake, maybe we should just leave. I don't want to be the reason for family problems, especially problems that involve excluding people who clearly belong here more than we do. Her grace and maturity in that moment made her more likable than she had been during our brief previous encounter, and it also highlighted how inappropriate my parents' decision-making had been. Dad tried to regain control of the situation by appealing to practical concerns. Nicole, this is all very dramatic, but we've all taken time off work, driven 3 hours to get here, and made plans for this retreat. Can't we just work something out for this weekend and discuss the house situation later? His appeal to practicality was ironic given that practical considerations had been used to justify my exclusion in the first place. Dad, I understand that everyone has made plans and taken time off work. I've made plans too. I plan to spend my summer vacation at my own lake house, enjoying the property I now own and the peaceful retreat I've created for myself. I paused to let that sink in before continuing. However, I'm willing to discuss arrangements for this weekend, but they'll need to be arrangements that acknowledge the current reality of who owns this property and who makes decisions about who stays here. The power shift was complete and undeniable. My parents, who had casually excluded me based on their own priorities and preferences, were now in the position of needing to negotiate with me for access to the family tradition they had controlled for 20 years. Mom tried a different approach, switching to the emotional manipulation tactics she typically used when practical arguments weren't working. Nicole, honey, you're hurting the whole family with this approach. The cousins and their children have been looking forward to this retreat all year. Are you really going to punish everyone because of a misunderstanding between us? But several family members immediately pushed back against her characterization of the situation. Mom, this wasn't a misunderstanding, Mark said firmly. You deliberately excluded Nicole from the family retreat to make room for people who aren't even family yet. That's not a misunderstanding, that's a choice you made, and now you're facing consequences for that choice. Uncle Paul nodded in agreement. Linda, I have to say, I'm pretty shocked by this whole situation. Nicole has been as much a part of these retreats as anyone, and the idea that you'd exclude her for people the family barely knows doesn't sit right with me at all. Even my typically diplomatic Aunt Jennifer added her perspective. I think Nicole has every right to be hurt and angry. If someone had told me there wasn't space for me at the family retreat so that relative strangers could attend instead, I'd be devastated. The family support was gratifying, but more importantly, it confirmed that my parents' decision had been as inappropriate and hurtful as I had perceived it to be. Other family members immediately recognized the unfairness of the situation when they heard the full story. Amanda spoke up again, her voice carrying genuine concern. "Look, I feel terrible about this whole situation. I had no idea that my coming here meant excluding someone from their own family tradition. Jake, we should absolutely leave and let Nicole's family work this out privately." Her continued grace under pressure was impressive, and it made the contrast with my parents' behavior even more stark. The virtual stranger my parents had prioritized over me was demonstrating more consideration for family harmony than they had. But Jake shook his head. "Amanda, you and the boys shouldn't have to leave because of decisions other people made. This isn't your fault, and you shouldn't be punished for it." I realized that the situation was becoming more complicated than I had anticipated, with family members who had done nothing wrong being caught in the middle of the conflict between my parents and me. "Everyone, let me be clear about something," I said, addressing the entire group. "This isn't about punishing anyone except the people who made the decision to exclude me. Jake, Amanda, I have no problem with you or your boys. You're welcome to stay if you'd like, but the terms are going to be different than what my parents arranged." I pulled out a folder containing rental agreements I had prepared. "This is my property now, so anyone who stays here will be my guests, following my rules, contributing to my expenses, and participating in activities I approve. If anyone finds those terms unacceptable, they're free to make other arrangements." The rental agreements were professional documents that outlined reasonable terms for property use, contribution to utilities and maintenance, and basic rules for respectful behavior. But the psychological impact of being asked to sign rental agreements for a property they had always accessed freely was exactly what I had intended. Dad's face had gone through several color changes during this conversation, and his voice was tight with barely controlled anger when he responded, "Nicole, this is vindictive and petty. You're destroying family relationships over hurt feelings. Dad, I'm establishing healthy boundaries based on how I've been treated. If you had wanted to maintain family relationships, perhaps you should have considered that before excluding me from family gatherings." Mom made one final attempt at emotional manipulation. "Sweetie, we raised you better than this. This isn't the kind of person we taught you to be. Family forgives and moves forward together." But I was done being lectured about family values by people who had demonstrated their own priorities so clearly. "You're absolutely right that this isn't the person you raised me to be," I replied calmly. "You raised me to be accommodating, flexible, and understanding when family members treated me poorly. But I've learned that being that person just encourages more poor treatment. So I'm trying out being someone who has boundaries and expects respect." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with various family members weighing in on different aspects of the situation. But the fundamental dynamic had been established. I owned the property, I controlled access to it, and anyone who wanted to stay would need to accept my terms and acknowledge my authority. In the end, 3 different groups made 3 different decisions about how to handle the situation, and each decision revealed important information about their characters and priorities. The immediate aftermath of my revelation created 3 distinct responses that perfectly illustrated where people's true loyalties lay and how they viewed family relationships. Amanda, with a dignity that made me respect her tremendously, gathered her boys and approached me directly. "Nicole, I'm so sorry this situation happened. I had no idea my presence was causing family problems, and I don't feel comfortable staying somewhere I'm not genuinely welcome. Could you recommend a good hotel in the area where the boys and I could stay for a few days? We drove all this way, and they were really excited about seeing the lake." Her grace under pressure was remarkable, and it highlighted everything that was wrong with my parents' handling of the situation. Here was someone who barely knew our family, showing more consideration for family harmony than the people who had raised me. "Amanda, you are genuinely welcome here," I said firmly. "My issue isn't with you or your children, it's with the people who decided to exclude their own daughter to accommodate you. If you'd like to stay, I'd be happy to have you as my guests. The boys can have the bunk room, and you and Jake can have the blue bedroom." Jake looked relieved and grateful, but also deeply uncomfortable with the family conflict his relationship had inadvertently caused. "Nicole, I feel terrible about this whole thing. I never meant for my bringing Amanda to cause problems between you and your parents. Jake, this problem existed long before you brought Amanda anywhere. This just forced it out into the open." Uncle Paul and Aunt Jennifer, along with my brother Mark and his wife, made the second type of decision. After a brief family discussion, Uncle Paul addressed my parents directly. "Mike, Linda, I think you handled this situation very poorly, and I think Nicole has every right to be hurt and angry. We're going to stay and enjoy the retreat, but we'll be staying as Nicole's guests, not yours." Mark nodded in agreement. "Nicole, thank you for buying this place and preserving our family tradition. I'm sorry Mom and Dad made you feel unwelcome, and I'm grateful you're willing to include the rest of us despite how they treated you." Their public support was emotionally overwhelming. For the first time in the entire ordeal, I felt genuinely emotional as I realized that other family members not only understood the unfairness of my exclusion but were willing to take sides in support of what was right rather than what was convenient. My parents, however, made the third type of decision, and it was perhaps the most revealing of all. After another whispered consultation between themselves, Dad approached me with barely controlled anger. "Nicole, if this is how you want to handle family relationships, then we'll make other arrangements. We're not going to sign rental agreements to stay in a house we've been using for 20 years, and we're not going to participate in this vindictive game you're playing." Mom nodded along. "We're very disappointed in you, Nicole. This behavior is beneath the daughter we raised, and we hope someday you'll realize that hurting family isn't the way to solve problems." Their decision to leave rather than acknowledge my property ownership or apologize for excluding me was the final confirmation I needed about their character and priorities. Even when faced with the consequences of their actions, they chose pride and stubbornness over family relationships and personal growth. "I understand that you're choosing to leave," I replied calmly. "I hope you can find suitable accommodations for your vacation. There are several hotels about 30 minutes from here that should have availability." As they packed their belongings back into their car, the contrast between their behavior and Amanda's was striking. She had been gracious, apologetic, and concerned about family harmony despite being a virtual stranger. They were angry, defensive, and accusatory despite being my parents who had created this entire situation through their own poor choices. The retreat that followed was different from our traditional gatherings, but it was also better in many ways. Without the tension and subtle favoritism that had always characterized my parents' management of family events, the atmosphere was more relaxed and genuinely inclusive. Amanda and her boys integrated beautifully with our family group, and she proved to be delightful company, funny, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in getting to know everyone. Her children were well-behaved and excited about all the lake activities, and they brought a fresh energy that reminded us all why we had loved these retreats in the first place. Uncle Paul spent time teaching Amanda's boys to fish from the dock, just as he had taught me years earlier. Mark's children enjoyed having other kids their age to play with, and Amanda contributed to meal planning and preparation in ways that felt natural and appreciated rather than obligatory. Most importantly, for the first time in years, I felt completely comfortable and welcome at the lake house retreat. As the property owner, I wasn't subject to anyone else's decisions about my inclusion or accommodation. I could participate fully in activities, contribute to planning, and enjoy the tradition without the underlying anxiety about whether my presence was truly valued. Jake pulled me aside on the second day of the retreat. "Nicole, I want you to know how much I appreciate you letting Amanda and the boys stay. She's been really touched by how welcoming everyone has been, and the boys haven't stopped talking about Uncle Paul's fishing lessons." "They're great kids, and she's lovely," I replied honestly. "I'm glad you found someone who fits so well with our family. I also want to apologize for my part in what happened with your parents. I should have asked more questions about the arrangements before assuming it was okay to bring guests to a family gathering. Jake, you did nothing wrong. This situation revealed problems that already existed, you didn't create them." The financial aspects of property ownership proved to be both manageable and satisfying. The lake house generated income through carefully selected rentals during non-family periods, and the family contributions to utilities and maintenance during our gatherings offset most of my ownership costs. But more importantly, owning the property gave me complete control over preserving the family traditions I valued while establishing boundaries against the family behaviors I wouldn't tolerate. 3 months after the confrontation, my parents reached out through Mark, asking if we could work something out for future family gatherings. The request came after they had apparently received feedback from other family members about their behavior and faced social consequences within their community for their treatment of me. Mark relayed their message: Mom and Dad are asking if there's some way they can participate in future lake house retreats. They say they miss the family tradition and realize they handled things poorly. My response was simple but firm: they're welcome to apply to be my guests like anyone else. That requires acknowledging my property ownership, apologizing for their previous behavior, following house rules, and contributing appropriately to expenses. If they can do those things genuinely, we can discuss future arrangements. 6 months later, they still hadn't been willing to meet those basic requirements for reconciliation, which told me everything I needed to know about their commitment to repairing our relationship versus their desire to simply regain access to the property and tradition they had taken for granted. This experience taught me something crucial about family relationships and personal boundaries that I wish I had learned years earlier. Sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who feel most entitled to treat you poorly, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable their bad behavior by absorbing it gracefully. Have you ever had family members who took your accommodation and flexibility for granted? How did you handle discovering that your presence was considered optional while strangers were prioritized? I'd love to hear your stories about setting boundaries with family members who forgot your value. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. I share more stories about family dynamics, boundary setting, and the journey to demanding the respect you deserve from people who should already be giving it freely. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss any new videos, and share this with anyone who might need to hear that they have the power to change family dynamics that aren't working for them. Thank you for watching and for all the incredible support you show by engaging with these videos. Remember that family relationships should be based on mutual respect and consideration, not on your willingness to accept whatever treatment people decide to give you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in systems that don't value you appropriately. Take care of yourselves, trust your worth, and remember that you teach people how to treat you by what you're willing to accept. I'll see you in the next video, and until then, keep building relationships with people who see your value without needing consequences to remind them of it.